For centuries, religious traditions have offered humanity a comforting promise that death is not the end. Whether through the concept of heaven and hell, reincarnation, or spiritual ascension, most religions assure their followers that their personal identity, their soul, will continue beyond the grave. This belief provides solace, a sense of justice, and an answer to the deepest existential fear: annihilation. But what if this idea of a personal afterlife is an illusion? The 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza offered a radically different perspective, one that directly challenges the foundation of religious doctrines. His vision of eternity doesn't involve pearly gates or reincarnation, but instead redefines what it means to live forever. To Spinoza, eternity is not about an individual soul persisting after death, but about something far more profound, something that dissolves the ego's desire for personal continuation. We'll uncover the shocking truth about life after death according to Spinoza. We'll explore why his ideas remain controversial, how they challenge religious orthodoxy, and what it truly means to attain immortality. Not in the way you might think, but in a way that transforms your understanding of existence itself. Most religious traditions depict God as a conscious, personal being, one who watches over humanity, judges moral actions, and rewards or punishes individuals in an afterlife. But Spinoza completely dismantles this notion. To him, God is not some supernatural ruler sitting outside the universe. Instead, God is the universe itself. Spinoza's radical idea, summed up in the phrase Deus sive natura, God or nature, means that God is not a separate entity but the very fabric of reality, the infinite, eternal substance of which everything is merely an expression. In other words, the cosmos itself is divine, and everything within it, stars, rivers, animals, humans, is simply a temporary mode or modification of this one infinite being. This perspective eliminates the idea of divine judgment altogether. There is no supreme deity handing out rewards or punishments. There is no heaven, no hell, no supernatural realm where the soul continues as an individual entity. Instead, life and death are just expressions of the same eternal, deterministic flow of nature. Everything follows from necessity, governed by the same laws that shape the stars and the tides. This challenges not only religious doctrines, but also the human desire for a personal and everlasting soul. If we are merely temporary manifestations of an infinite substance, what happens when we die? Do we disappear entirely, or do we in some sense remain eternal? Religions often offer comforting assurances about death, that we will live on as individuals, that our consciousness will persist, and that we will reunite with loved ones in another realm. But for Spinoza, this is an illusion. According to his philosophy, our individual existence is merely a fleeting modification of an eternal, infinite substance, nature itself. We are not separate, independent beings with eternal souls, but temporary expressions of the same underlying reality. Just as a wave rises and falls back into the ocean, so too do we emerge from and dissolve back into the infinite whole. When we die, our body returns to nature in a physical sense, decomposing into the same material forces that once sustained it. But what about the mind? For Spinoza, the mind is simply the idea of the body, a mode of thought that exists only as long as the body functions. Once the body ceases, so does this particular mode of consciousness. There is no personal continuation of the self, no soul carrying on into an afterlife, no migration to another realm. Death is not a transition to another existence, but a dissolution, a return to the vast, impersonal reality from which we came. However, does this mean Spinoza denies all forms of immortality? Not exactly. A perspective that is far more profound than any personal afterlife. Spinoza does not completely reject the idea of eternity, but he redefines it in a way that radically departs from religious tradition. Instead of promising an afterlife where the soul continues as a distinct personal entity, Spinoza argues that true eternity is something we can experience right now in this life. At the core of his philosophy is the concept of amor intellectualis Dei, the intellectual love of God. This is not an emotional or devotional love, but rather a deep, rational understanding of the universe as it truly is. The more we align our minds with this understanding, the more we participate in what Spinoza calls eternity. But what does this actually mean? According to Spinoza, the human mind consists of two parts. 1. The passive mind, which is tied to fleeting emotions, desires, and the physical body. 2. The active intellectual mind, which seeks truth and understands the necessity of all things. When the body dies, the passive mind, which is attached to personal identity, emotions, and experiences, disappears. However, the active mind, to the extent that it has grasped eternal truths, remains as part of God nature. This is not an individual survival, but rather a form of intellectual immortality, where true knowledge exists beyond time and individual experience. In essence, we achieve eternity, not by living forever as individuals, but by transcending our ego and merging with the infinite order of reality through knowledge. The more we grasp the nature of existence, the more we live in eternity. Not after death, but here and now. This is the real immortality Spinoza offers. Not a personal afterlife, but the dissolution of the self into a higher, eternal understanding. But what does this mean for how we live our lives? We'll explore the practical implications of Spinoza's radical vision of eternity. Spinoza's radical philosophy didn't just challenge religious beliefs, it threatened the very foundations of religious power. For centuries, religious institutions maintained control over people's lives through a system of reward and punishment, promising heaven to the faithful and threatening hell for sinners. This fear-based structure ensured obedience, loyalty, and submission to religious authority. But Spinoza's vision completely dismantles this framework. If there is no personal afterlife, no eternal punishment or reward, then what incentive is there to obey religious leaders? If salvation comes not through faith, rituals, or divine grace, but through rational understanding, then religion loses its monopoly on truth. This is why Spinoza was considered so dangerous. His ideas stripped religion of its power, placing truth in the hands of individuals who seek knowledge rather than blindly follow doctrine. His belief that God is nature meant that divine authority was not something handed down by priests or sacred texts, but something that could be grasped through philosophy, science, and reason. The consequences were severe. Spinoza was excommunicated from the Jewish community of Amsterdam at just 23 years old, cursed with one of the harshest religious bans in history. He was labeled a heretic, his books were banned, and his ideas were condemned by both Jewish and Christian authorities alike. His crime? Daring to reveal a truth that made religious control obsolete. Yet, despite being silenced by religious leaders, Spinoza's ideas survived. Today, they continue to challenge traditional beliefs and offer a profound, rational alternative to the fear-based promises of organized religion. But if Spinoza is right, if there is no heaven, no hell, and no personal afterlife, how should we live? For many, the fear of death is a source of anxiety, shaping their beliefs, decisions, and even morality. Religions have long used this fear to guide human behavior, offering salvation as a solution to the unknown. But Spinoza teaches that this fear is unnecessary, because we were never truly separate from nature to begin with. Instead of obsessing over what happens after we die, Spinoza urges us to focus on what we can control, living rationally, seeking knowledge, and understanding the world as it truly is. When we grasp that we are not isolated beings but expressions of an eternal, infinite reality, the fear of personal extinction loses its grip on us. This perspective is deeply liberating. If there is no divine judgment, then morality is not about pleasing a higher power, but about living wisely and ethically for the sake of life itself. If there is no heaven or hell, then the meaning of life isn't found in religious obedience, but in understanding, growth, and inner peace. Spinoza's philosophy invites us to shift our focus from fear to freedom, from superstition to reason, from blind faith to true knowledge. In doing so, we don't just prepare for death, we learn how to truly live. And perhaps, in the deepest sense, this is what eternity really means. Spinoza's vision of eternity is one of the most radical challenges to traditional religious beliefs, and that's exactly why religious institutions have long sought to suppress it. His philosophy strips away the fear-based structures of heaven and hell, replacing them with a profound but impersonal truth. We were never separate from eternity to begin with. The idea of a personal afterlife, where the soul carries on as an individual, is an illusion. What truly lasts is not our ego, our emotions, or our personal memories, but our connection to eternal truths, truths that exist beyond any single life, beyond time itself. Spinoza offers not just a different idea of immortality, but a completely different way of looking at existence. We don't need salvation because we were never lost. We don't need to fear death because we were never separate from nature. We don't need religious rituals because truth is found through reason, not faith. This is the truth that religion doesn't want you to know. Because if people understood that eternity is not about personal survival, but about aligning with reality through knowledge, the power of religious institutions would crumble. But for those willing to embrace this perspective, the reward is greater than any promise of an afterlife. It is freedom from fear, a deep sense of peace, and a life truly lived in understanding. And in the end, that is the only eternity that truly matters.